I never expected confidence to feel like this, so heavy, so electric, pressed down over my shoulders like the weight of a voice I couldn't ignore. She leaned over my desk that morning, the smell of her perfume faint but sharp, like cedar and something warmer I couldn't place. "Confidence is easy, but can you keep up with me?" she said, and I didn't even know how to answer. My hands froze on the keyboard, typing stopped mid-thought, because suddenly the classroom, or the office, or whatever this was, felt smaller, tighter, almost intimate in a way that made me aware of my own skin. I work at a small independent bookstore. It's the kind of place that smells like old paper and coffee, where sunlight leaks through tall windows and lands on the dust motes that float lazily above the shelves. Most mornings I'm invisible here, stacking books, rearranging displays, quietly apologizing to the air if I bump into a corner. But she didn't let me hide. Her name is Marianne. I didn't know much about her at first, just that she had a sharp mind, an older elegance that didn't try to fit in, and an aura that made everyone in the room lean a little forward, either to listen or to avoid her glance. She wore a tailored blazer that somehow made her look both professional and untouchable, with glasses perched low on her nose, and hair pinned back in a way that was effortless but deliberate. She had a way of moving through the aisles that made the space feel alive, even when it was empty. And when she looked at me, it wasn't polite interest. It was precise, calculated, almost, but warm enough to make me fumble my words. That morning, she had asked for help finding a rare edition of a novel I hadn't seen in years. I remember kneeling down to reach the lower shelf, fumbling with the spines, when her hand brushed mine for a fraction of a second. It wasn't much, really. Maybe she didn't even notice, but it made the air crackle like static. I lifted my gaze, trying to act casual, but her eyes held mine longer than they should have. There was a pause, a hesitation that wasn't in the schedule of the day, and I felt like time had gotten sloppy, stretching and condensing around her presence. She tilted her head slightly, letting a half-smile curl across her lips as she watched me straighten up with the book in my hands. "Careful with that," she said softly, almost teasing, almost serious, and for a second I wasn't sure if she was warning me about the fragile pages, or me. I laughed nervously, though it came out rough, uneven. She didn't laugh back. Instead, she leaned over the counter, resting her elbows lightly against the wood, and for a heartbeat I thought I could read everything she wouldn't say. We didn't exchange names that first day beyond the polite formalities. I didn't ask where she came from, what she did outside of this place, or why she made the simplest interaction feel like a puzzle I was desperate to solve. And yet, hours later, I could still feel the imprint of her presence, the soft curve of her wrist as it hovered over the book, the faint scent she left behind, the quiet authority in the way she moved through the world. I caught myself staring at the spot she had just vacated, wondering if I imagined the small tremor in her fingers when she adjusted her glasses. And I realized, with a mix of panic and something else entirely, that I hadn't been able to stop thinking about her since that moment. About the pause, about the glance, about the impossible, unspoken weight of confidence that made me feel exposed and alive at the same time. It wasn't planned, seeing her again so soon. I had been shelving returned books when she appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, scanning the stacks like she owned the place, which, in a way, she did. I straightened immediately, though I knew she probably didn't care. "I thought you might know where this is," she said, holding up a thin manuscript, her voice steady but quiet, almost as if she were trying not to admit something to herself. There was a tightness around her eyes, subtle but there. Maybe fatigue, maybe something else. I followed her down the narrow aisle, and she walked just a step ahead, deliberately distant. The air between us felt charged, like a wire strung too taut. I noticed the way her fingers grazed the edges of the shelves, lightly, almost absent-mindedly. Careful, precise. And the faint tremor of her hands when she finally opened the book. I caught it, and something in me ached. "You seem tired," I said, more than I meant to. Immediately I regretted it. People didn't like to admit weakness to her. But she paused, glanced down at the book, and for the briefest moment her eyes softened. "I've had a long week," she murmured, closing her eyes for a fraction of a second, as though letting the exhaustion show for only me. Then she straightened abruptly, brushing the edge of the book with her thumb, and that vulnerability vanished, replaced by her usual composed self. I wanted to linger on the moment, trace it out in the air like a fragile drawing, but she had already moved to the next shelf. So I followed, quietly, noticing things I hadn't before. The slight downturn of her lips when she frowned at a missing title, the way her hair fell loose across her collar when she leaned over, the almost imperceptible sigh that escaped her. She was careful not to reveal anything, yet everything leaked in fragments. I realized I was memorizing her movements, the rhythm of her gestures, the small human flaws beneath the confident exterior. Her laugh, soft, rare, and slightly embarrassed, escaped when she realized she'd dropped a pencil behind the counter. She bent over to retrieve it, and I caught her profile in the slanting morning light, the shadow of a smile touching her cheek. I wanted to say something, anything, to make her pause, to see if she'd let me in, even for a second. But she was already straightening, adjusting the sleeves of her blazer, reassembling the composure she wore like armor. When she finally turned toward me, her eyes caught mine just long enough to spark a tiny current I couldn't place. She didn't speak, but her glance lingered, questioning perhaps, or warning. I didn't know. I only knew my pulse had sped, and my hands itched to reach for something. Her, or the space between us, or maybe just the moment that was slipping away too quickly. She gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and stepped back. And I realized I was watching her walk away, heart thudding in a quiet, helpless rhythm, thinking of the tremor in her hands, the half-smile she couldn't entirely hide, the warmth that lingered in the air long after she had gone. And I knew I would be thinking about it for hours. The rain tapped insistently against the bookstore windows, a soft, constant drum that made the shelves feel smaller, more private. We were alone, or almost alone. Marianne had stayed late, ostensibly to inventory the rare editions in the back, but I had been shelving the returns until the quiet dragged me back toward her. She was crouched by the lower shelf, pencil tucked behind her ear, scribbling notes in a small leather notebook. The lamplight slanted across her face, highlighting the faint shadows beneath her eyes. I wanted to ask if she'd slept at all last night, if she ever let herself slow down, but the words died in my throat. I was too aware of the space between us, too conscious of how her elbow brushed mine as I handed her a misplaced volume. There was a pause. A flicker of something almost unspoken passed between us. I caught her glance lingering on my hands for a moment, and I thought I saw hesitation there, like she wanted to ask something she wasn't supposed to. My pulse sped, but I stayed still, careful, my voice a quiet anchor. "You always stay late," I said, trying to sound casual, like this wasn't the moment that felt heavier than any exam I'd ever faced. She smiled faintly, almost rueful. "Some things don't get done during the day." Her fingers traced the edge of the shelf, tapping lightly, a rhythm I suddenly wanted to memorize. There was something fragile in her posture, the way her shoulders slumped for just a fraction of a second, then straightened as if I hadn't seen anything. I took a step closer to hand her another book, and suddenly the air felt too thick. Her hand brushed mine, not enough to matter, but enough to make my chest tighten. I wanted to reach out, to hold it, to let her know I noticed every tiny movement, but I didn't. Not yet. I had to respect the unspoken rules, the invisible walls we hadn't crossed. Then her phone buzzed on the counter, a sharp interruption. She glanced down, and I caught the brief flash of annoyance, and maybe something else, memory, regret, the weight of someone else in her life. She silenced it without looking at the screen, and the moment cracked. I wanted to ask what that was about, who it was, but she had already moved past, adjusting the notebook, clearing the air between us like nothing had happened. I stayed close, watching her, noticing how the lamplight caught the strands of her hair, the subtle tremor in her hand as she straightened a stack of books. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing harder against the windows. We were near, almost too near, the warmth of her body just inches from mine. I wanted to say something foolish, something honest, but the words stuck, caught between desire and restraint. Instead, I just handed her the last book, our fingers brushing one more time, a fleeting contact charged with everything we weren't saying. She met my eyes for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, then exhaled softly and turned away. And I stood there, heart hammering, hands tingling, thinking about the line between restraint and surrender, knowing the next touch could change everything, and yet it didn't. Not tonight. The shop was nearly dark, only the overhead lamp above the counter casting a weak circle of light. Rain had slowed to a drizzle outside, leaving streaks across the windows that distorted the world beyond. Marianne was leaning against the counter, arms folded, staring at nothing. I wanted to break the quiet, but the words lodged somewhere between my ribs and my throat. "You're different," I said finally, my voice uneven, as if speaking might shatter the fragile atmosphere. I wasn't sure why I said it. Different wasn't exactly the right word, but it was honest. She tilted her head slowly, a faint crease forming between her brows. "Different how?" she asked, and there was no playfulness in her tone, no pretense. Just careful observation, as if she were examining me in the same way I'd been examining her for weeks. I swallowed. "I don't know, like, nothing here is the same when you're around. And I can't tell if that's good or bad." My fingers fidgeted with the edge of a book, the lamplight catching the tremor in my hands. She didn't answer at once. Instead, she let out a soft exhale, one that sounded like frustration, resignation, and something else I couldn't name. Then, almost too quietly, she said, "I don't even know what this is." The confession hung in the air like smoke. I realized I'd been holding my breath. That she was admitting it, just that small, tiny truth, made my chest ache in ways I hadn't anticipated. I stepped closer, but not too close, just close enough to share the same quiet space. "Neither do I said. "But it feels impossible to pretend it doesn't exist." My voice was steadier than I expected, though my hands still shook slightly. She glanced at me then, really looked, and for the first time I noticed the way her eyes seemed to hold both exhaustion and vigilance, like she was guarding something precious while simultaneously weighing the risk of letting it go. The air between us pulsed with everything we weren't saying, everything the words could never capture. "You make me, I don't know, feel like I'm failing at everything I thought I understood," she whispered finally, and the vulnerability in her voice hit me in the chest like a physical blow. She turned slightly away, as if to shield herself from the intensity of her own words. I wanted to reach for her, to say something to fix it, to steady it, but there was nothing to fix. There was only honesty in the silence, raw and trembling. So I stayed still, letting the words linger, letting her breathe. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, then opened them again, and I saw something I hadn't seen before, a trace of fear, yes, but also a brittle hope that maybe, somehow, someone could understand. "Why are we doing this?" she asked finally, voice barely above the hum of the fluorescent light. The question wasn't about romance or desire. It was about the complicated mess of human proximity, the emotional gravity we'd created and neither of us knew how to escape. And then, after a long, tense silence, she added, almost to herself, almost as if confessing to the empty room, "I think I'm already too far in." It started with a misplaced envelope. I was sorting through the supply closet when I noticed a thin, cream-colored paper tucked behind a stack of ledgers. Marianne's handwriting curled across the front, "To whoever still cares." My heart stuttered. I should have left it alone. But curiosity, that slow burn, made me slide it out and open it. She didn't notice me at first, bent over the counter in her usual careful posture, pencil scratching in her notebook. I watched her from the doorway, hesitating, and the quiet between us felt fragile, as if it could shatter at the slightest misstep. I cleared my throat, gently. "Marianne, what's this?" My voice was tentative, almost afraid to pull her into whatever memory this was. She froze. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she closed her notebook and exhaled, a sound heavy with years of restraint. "It's nothing. Just old correspondence." She didn't meet my eyes, fingers brushing over the counter nervously. But something had shifted. She seemed smaller somehow, more human, vulnerable in a way I hadn't allowed myself to see before. I stepped closer, careful not to intrude, just enough to make her aware that I was there. "You can tell me if it's not nothing," I said softly. Her gaze finally found mine, and I caught a tremor in her jaw. "I lost someone a long time ago," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "It was sudden. I never really got the chance to say goodbye, and I think that's why I carry it around." Her confession landed like a stone in still water. I didn't know what to say, because there was nothing I could say that would make it right. All I could do was notice. Notice the faint quiver in her hands as she rested them on the counter. Notice the way her eyes glistened under the soft lamp. Notice how fragile her usual armor seemed when she let just a sliver of truth escape. I remember someone you might have been close to, I said carefully, unsure if this was reckless or comforting. A friend, maybe. Or someone else? You talked about her once, I think. My words were tentative, more question than statement. She blinked slowly, a shiver passing over her shoulders. I don't talk about her, she murmured. Not really. It's easier to pretend the memory isn't there. Her hands twisted together in the faint light, the notebook forgotten. We stood in silence, the quiet stretching long enough to make my chest ache. I realized I had been holding my breath the whole time, holding myself in check because this was her story, not mine to solve. And then, finally, she looked at me, not with the usual composure, not with her careful distance, but with something raw and fragile. Her lips parted slightly, as if to speak, and then she didn't. She just exhaled, letting the tension drain from her shoulders, letting the weight of what she had carried so long settle into the space between us. I noticed the way her eyes softened, the faint tremble in her fingers, and I realized I would remember this moment for a long time. The slow, seismic shift of seeing her truly human, and the quiet ache it left inside me. The bookstore was quiet that evening. The rain finally faded to a soft drizzle. We had been working side by side, rearranging shelves, cataloging returns, and somehow the hours had slipped past unnoticed. Marianne moved with her usual deliberate care, but there was an tonight, a small loosening of the tension I'd seen in her all along. I watched her reach for a book on the top shelf. The lamp caught her hair, turning strands into threads of gold in the dim light. Without thinking, I stepped closer, instinctively nudging the stack so she could reach it without stretching too far. She glanced at me, and for a moment, we held each other's gaze, neither speaking, both aware of something we hadn't named. She began, and then stopped, shaking her head lightly. The words vanished, replaced by a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes entirely, but reached me. I realized she didn't need to say anything. The confession had already happened in the small acts, the shared glances, the quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence. We returned to our work, cataloging and stacking, but the air between us felt different, lighter, but charged. I noticed the subtle things I had always missed, the way her hand lingered on a book before setting it down, the careful way she balanced on the stool, the way she exhaled quietly when she finally sat on the floor to check the bottom shelves. Every movement felt familiar now, intimate without being romantic, as though our lives had folded into the same small rhythm. I knelt beside her to organize a stack of old journals, close enough that our shoulders brushed lightly. I could feel the warmth, subtle but undeniable, and the faint pulse in her wrist when our hands accidentally touched. Neither of us flinched. Instead, we let the contact linger, tiny but significant, a quiet agreement that whatever this was, we were both here for it. I think, she said softly after a long pause, we've been pretending we could ignore it. But I don't think we can anymore. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of vulnerability that made me want to promise her safety without needing to speak it aloud. I didn't respond with words. I didn't need to. I just reached out, brushing her fingers lightly with mine as I handed her the next book. She caught my hand, a fleeting squeeze, and then let go. The small gesture carried the weight of everything we had been holding back, the uncertainty, the longing, the slow recognition that we belonged in the same quiet space, if only for now. We sat there, side by side on the floor, surrounded by towers of books and scattered papers. The world outside, the rain, the fading light, the empty street, mattered less than this shared space, the silent understanding that had finally settled between us. No declarations, no dramatic gestures, just the simple acknowledgement that we were both here, and that this, whatever it was enough. Her shoulder brushed mine once more, a gentle, imperceptible reassurance, and I let myself lean in slightly, careful, patient, content. The quiet was enough. The small, earned closeness was enough. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt the tension inside me ease, folding into the stillness, carrying the quiet finality of understanding without a single word. It's strange how some moments stay with you, long after the world has moved on. I think about that evening often, the quiet after the rain, the soft hum of the bookstore around us, The way Marianne's shoulder brushed mine. Just enough to feel human, but not enough to rush anything. I don't think either of us would call it love in the usual sense. Not at first, anyway. It was something quieter, slower, an acknowledgement of shared vulnerability, of mutual understanding. It changed the way I noticed her, yes, but it changed me too. I started seeing the subtle truths in people, the unspoken hesitations, the weight they carry silently. And I think Marianne, well, she let herself lean into the possibility that someone could see her without judgment, without needing her to perform confidence all the time. We didn't rewrite our lives. There were no dramatic confessions or impulsive decisions. There were still deadlines, still rainstorms, still moments when the past tugged at her or my own insecurities flared. But the space between us, once tense and electric, became something sustainable, something we could inhabit without fear, without pretending. I remember how ordinary the next morning felt. We were cataloging returns, coffee mugs warm at our elbows, soft lights spilling through the tall windows. And yet, every glance, every accidental brush of a hand, carried the weight of what we had slowly earned, the quiet permission to exist in each other's presence fully. What I learned, maybe, is that love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it's a hand that lingers a second too long, a shoulder brushed in silence, a shared smile over nothing at all. That's what she gave me. That's what I hope I gave her in return. I think about the letters, the old heartbreaks, the hesitations, and realize they weren't barriers. They were the proof that we were capable of something real, something human, something worth noticing. And maybe that's the kind of love that lasts, not the kind that announces itself in fireworks, but the kind that quietly reshapes the ordinary until it feels extraordinary. Sitting here now, I can almost hear the faint echo of her voice in the stacks, see the soft tilt of her head as she smiles at a misfiled book. I remember the tremor in her hands that first day, the way her laugh floated briefly when she thought no one was listening, and the slow, subtle steps that brought us to this shared understanding. There's no rush, no need for anything more than what exists now. And maybe that's the point. The patience, the subtlety, the slow recognition that sometimes the most powerful connections are the ones that sneak in quietly, fold into the spaces we inhabit, and leave us changed forever. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?